you. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Adrien, for speaking to us about degrowth. Adrien Plomteux is with us today. He is completing his PhD at the Institute for Global Prosperity at UCL. His research investigates strategies for social transformation towards degrowth-aligned futures, with a particular focus on anti-authoritarianism, which is very topical today. He is the founding member of Degrowth London and an editor of the Degrowth Journal. Thank you very much, Adrien, for being here. And can I just start?
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you. You're very welcome. Can I just start by asking you to just guide us through degrowth and tell us mainly what it means and maybe how your work frames the concept? I'm sure a lot of us are not familiar with this concept, or we all have very little knowledge on it.
Sure. So let's, on a basic level, degrowth is an academic and social movement that is focused on what I would say three pillars. The first is a critique of growth-based societies, on economic growth as an objective for our societies. The second the second pillar is the vision of desirable future. So if we criticize this society, what do we have to advocate for that is different? And the third pillar is then the question of the how. How would we get there? The question of strategy, which is the one that I focus more on. Just to give you a little sense, I will talk a little bit about each of these three pillars, mostly the first two, and then I will also give a little bit of history of degrowth. It might take a few minutes, but just to get us a little bit on page. So in terms of critique, degrowth has several of them, and it generally tries to criticize holistically the societies we live in, but generally people come to it from an ecological point of view, from the ecological critique, which is a criticism of the objective of our society, which is green growth. And this idea of green growth is that we would be able to decouple two curves, two indicators. One is the size of the economy, which is more or less the amount of stuff that we produce and consume worldwide and in a given economy. And the other one is the environmental impact, the greenhouse gas emissions, the amount of species on Earth, the pollution, the energy consumption, and so on. And the assumption of green growth is that it would be possible to decouple these two curves. So you would continue to have economic growth, but you would reduce the environmental impacts. And the critique of degrowth is, well, the first one is that empirically it has not been happening. We have not seen this happening at all to the scale and to the extent that we need. There have been some countries that have been able to reduce a little bit their environmental impacts, such as the UK, for example, while continuing to increase the size of the economy, but it has not at all happened on a global scale, and only for a few indicators, so not for every indicator, and not at all to the scale we need. For example, if we would want to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, we would need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by around 10% a year in the next decades, and they are still growing. So we are very far from that. So this is the more empirical side, and on the theoretical side, there are some people that also use natural laws to try to prove that it's a bit generally impossible to continue on a finite planet to have more production and consumption. They use the entropy law and so on. So this is the more ecological aspect of it, but I think that degrowth is also distinct from other discourses and schools of thought that criticize economic growth for not just being about the ecology. It's also a cultural critique. It's also a critique of capitalism, a critique of the inequalities between the North and the South, the critiques of technologies and industries, and so on. So it's in this holistic aspect that makes degrowth quite distinct. So this is the critique aspect. And then in terms of vision, and this goes a little bit more into my work, so degrowth as a vision of an alternative that is based on some principles and values such as justice, care, conviviality, simplicity, deep relationship between people and the natural world. And the way that I myself frame this vision of the future is through the idea of frugal abundance. So it's intuitively refers to the idea of being rich. You are abundant, but you're also frugal because you have you do not have too much production and consumption at the individual and the collective level. So I quite like this idea because it's a bit like the word degrowth. It's a clash between two things. Like growth is supposed to be good, and then you do not want that. So it creates a clash. Here with the word frugal abundance, it's something that makes you a clash between abundance and frugality, and so it makes you a bit question things already. So I quite like this one. Others prefer other terms. So Tim Jackson talks about prosperity without growth. Some people will talk about the well-being economy, alternative hedonism. Jason Hickel talks about radical abundance. So there are different ways to frame it. And I also particularly like it because in my work, I tried to co-create the meaning of what that would be, this idea of frugal abundance, so that vision of the future that we would want. Because something that, for me at least, is important is for degrowth not to just be something that would be expert-led vision of the future. I want something that is in which the everyday life of people is taken into account, which is not just some kind of top-down imposition. As you said, I'm in an anti-authoritarian framework. So in that sense, I've been doing some research with some Maasai people in Kenya and in a remote village in Iceland, in which I was trying to co-create this meaning using their own everyday experience of something that is along the lines of that. Many people will have an experience of this idea that being rich doesn't just mean having a lot of money. So there are a lot of ways in which people can relate to that. And that's my starting point for the vision of the future. And then in terms of the third pillar, so the how question, how do we get there? This is the most disputed one within degrowth. Most people who come to degrowth would more or less agree on the critiques and on the vision, but then these are the things that like glue people together in some way. And then there is the how question that everyone has a very different opinion, and so that's the $1 million question, and yeah, that's the one I'm researching on, and we might talk a little bit more about that later. Not giving you all the details now, but maybe yeah, go on. Yes, I just wanted to say that I think it's also something that makes degrowth distinct from quite a lot of other left-wing or like alternative movements, in that compared to, let's say, a Marxist-Leninist group or an activist movement like Extinction Rebellion or a political party, for example, these are glued partly at least by their vision of how you change the world. And degrowth is not glued by that. It's glued more by its vision of what it wants to achieve. And then like the competing views come into the question of strategy. So it's a little bit different. Just a tiny bit on the history. So degrowth as a term is a translation of the French term décroissance, which was first used in the 70s, but mostly popularized and became a movement of its own in the early 2000s. Décroissance means just something like reduction, and generally it's used to talk about a reduced size of the economy. And the people that used it wanted to subvert the usual meaning of the term in order to make it something that would shock the population, shock the elites, and just like make it something that would seem desirable, even though usually it's something that should not be. So started as a movement like this, mostly in the anti-advertising and alter-globalization movement. It spread in the Mediterranean world in the 2000s before coming to English in 2008 through a conference in Paris. That's when the term was translated. And then it became more academic, especially in the English-speaking world, although at the beginning it was a bit more activist, or at least like a mix of the two. Now it's more academic. There have been, depending on the sources, between a few hundreds and more than 1,000 academic articles published on the topic. So it's become quite a legitimate field within academia, with still connections with social movements. That's in my answer.
Thank you, Adrien. It's very interesting that this is my silly comment, but that the term was translated in 2008, which I think is probably the last moment when we had our sorry it's, the moment when I think everyone realized that there was something wrong with neoliberal capitalism. It was that era of crisis, and the term comes into the English language, which means, unfortunately, given the stakes of the English language in academia and research, that it's when it became worldwide available in a sense. But yeah, and in a way, it touches on all the hot topics, if you will. Care especially is something that I find very interesting, because it is something that we need to rethink. But because I am aware of time, I will move on to the next question. But thank you very much. And it's a question about, obviously, what most people misunderstand degrowth as. So degrowth is often misunderstood as simply negative growth, or it's accused of being unfeasible, socially regressive. Um, how would you define it, or how would you respond to these critiques? How is degrowth defined in a way that captures its political, ethical, and ecological dimensions? As you say, it's glued by a vision of what it wants to achieve. But can you maybe say a bit more about that and how to achieve it? And I will just remind everyone that we will answer the questions at the end of the session.
Sure. So I've already talked a little bit about like my broad vision, which is around this frugal abundance. But the way that I think about this vision, there are a few principles that are key to me. You mentioned one of them, which is care, which is very important and comes from the more feminist literature. For me, what is particularly important is to try to achieve a world in which we achieve a good life for everyone, which implies that there would be the basic needs of everyone are satisfied. That's the bare minimum. You also have the desires of everyone would be satisfied, at least the material ones. And then another aspect which is key is the question of justice. And justice in degrowth is understood in a very holistic sense. It is social, it is ecological, it is decolonial, feminist. And generally the idea of justice in the context of degrowth is related to the idea of enough. So the idea that you would try to have a low enough level of consumption and production in order to achieve this justice. Why so? Because if we live in a finite planet, if we extract too much from the earth, then there is no way that the species can continue to flourish. So in that sense, it's for ecological justice. For social justice, well, if the planet is finite, then the pie is finite, which means that if some people take too much, then there is not enough to satisfy the basic needs of others. So it's the Gandhian phrase that live simply so that others can simply live. So yeah, justice and good life are, I think, two of the main pillars for me. And more broadly, it is about fighting all sorts of domination while being in the limits of the planet. So for me, it's an emancipatory ecological vision in itself. And so in that sense, it already replies a little bit to one of your to one of the criticisms that you mentioned some people do, which is about it being socially regressive. For me, it's in itself an emancipatory project. Some people would say that some people would just caricature degrowth as being something that wants to go back to the cave, or about like living like the Amish people. And whilst it is true that degrowth is about simplicity very often, and about there is also a critique of the idea that technologies will save us. There is it's against the discourse that would be like overwhelmingly focused on innovation and technology. It doesn't mean that it's about going back to the cave. On the other hand, one thing that I like to emphasize is that the past was also not necessarily all bad. There were some good things in the past as well. And if we can revive and update some elements from the past, some of them, not all of them, then we might create a future that is not completely uprooted from the past, which I think is quite important as well if we want to be rooted in some cultures and some identity as well. Then it can be something that is some kind of trade-off between the past and the future, and I quite like that. What else did you mention? Yes, about negative growth. So one of the and as you said, it's interesting that it came in 2008 in English because it was the time in which there was the austerity narratives and so on. So one of the first slogans of degrowth was "Your recession is not our degrowth," because recession generally is the negative consequences of not having economic growth or having the size of the economy that goes down in a given time. And obviously, the growthers agree that in the capitalist system in which we live, this has bad consequences, but such as unemployment, such as not having enough money to fund the NHS, and etc., etc. But this is only, they would say, it is only in the framework of our growth-based societies, and that we could create something different, and that there have been enough examples in the past and in the present of societies that are organized quite differently and that are able to achieve quite good things without having to fall into what we call recession. So this is not too complicated to answer, I think. And about the one that is about unfeasibility, about degrowth being difficult to achieve. Well, I think there are two things to differentiate. The one is about it being unfeasible because it would be against human nature. And I think that this is misplaced in the sense that we know that there have been so many different sorts of societies on Earth that humans have a tendency to be quite malleable. It's not like they can be anything, but they can be quite different depending on the institutions and the values of their own society. And so if we would create something quite different, then some things along the lines of what degrowth advocates for would be possible, I would say. I don't see why it wouldn't be the case. And then on the other hand, obviously we know that what degrowth advocates for is quite radical and alternative, and so it's difficult to make it happen. There is no doubt about that. People over the last centuries, many people have tried to change the world radically, and they have failed. So we have to be humble about that. But on the other hand, if we consider that continuing on the path we are or just tinkering with the current system is likely to cause environmental catastrophes of a size that we have not seen before, and maybe when people say to come to a collapse or at least to sufferings for billions of people, that's not something we want, then I think it's worth striving for this kind of changes. It doesn't have to be under the umbrella of degrowth, but something that is quite radically different from what we live in today.
Yes, and it's so unfortunately topical what you're saying, I think, and in a way it links to my next question, which is about the rise of authoritarianism. I think there is so much to say about, well, we're not going to get into politics, obviously, but there would be so much to say about what we have achieved as a society, what we want to achieve, and what would be good for us as a society. But I will not. I'm trying to restrain myself. But so I'm just going to move on, but thank you. I think that was very clear. But as a reminder, please do pop your questions in the chat box. Part of your work is also about the position of degrowth in regard to the rise of authoritarianism, and another critique that has been sorry, another critique that people usually move to degrowth is that that you would have to impose degrowth, and that would be just like imposing limits to someone's life. So I was wondering if you could maybe say something about that. Again, I know that it's a very topical question today.
Yeah, yeah. So I think we have to differentiate between authoritarianisms from the right and from the left. So I think it's quite clear that degrowth is against all forms of right-wing authoritarianism of the kind of American libertarianism or Trumpism and or whatever things like that, because it is supposed to be an emancipatory project. So that there is nothing that could be about imposing privileges for a class over others by violent means. That's completely alien to degrowth. But then that is true that degrowth is sometimes criticized because it is about limits. Then you have in some way to impose something. So how do you impose it in some way without being authoritarian? And some people would say that there is no way. So then it becomes authoritarian in itself. For me, the answer is through the notion of autonomy, which is quite important within degrowth. It was claimed to be central, at least in the first years. And the way it is generally understood is through the philosophy of the Greek-French philosopher called Cornelius Castoriadis, who died at the end of the last century. And for him, autonomy is about individuals and communities being able to self-institute society, by which he means that they would genuinely have a say on society and genuinely be able to have an impact if they want to on the directions in which it is going. So in a sense, it's an extreme form of democracy that is not representative, or at least much less, and more participatory and direct. And this version of autonomy is something that Castoriadis talks quite a lot about, requires the self-awareness of people, that they are not just like following some, like they would be propagandized and they would just follow whatever the experts would tell them, or like the leaders would tell them. And I think it's a crucial notion that he gives, which is self-limitation. So it's this idea that if we are together striving for a common good, then there are some things that I might individually or in my little group want, but for the greater good, this is not something that we might not be able to all have everything that we want. So we have to self-limit ourselves. And if it is something that we are able to understand and be aware of, then it becomes something that we can just consent on. It's not in society, we don't always get what we want, but as long as we are okay with it and that we still get most of what we want, then it's fine. So in that sense, it's not an imposition from the top, but it's something that we consent to. And in that sense, I think it replies quite well to these criticisms. I would say that on the other hand, in the last years within degrowth, there has been a rise of a discourse that is more focused on an imposition on some over others. And it's related to a rise of more orthodox forms of Marxism within degrowth. Just to say an extreme example of someone who is not a degrowther, but who is popular in some spheres, Andreas Malm, the eco-Marxist, who called himself even an eco-Leninist. So that gives you quite well the kind of ideas in which, like, he talks about the fact that we would need to impose global veganism through the state, in which you would repress people who don't follow. You would impose global caps on consumption that would be extremely hard and would like decrease, and the state and the bureaucracy would decide who gets to consume what and so on. Like this for me is authoritarian, and if you're willing to call yourself a Leninist, it's quite clear that you are. And it's in some spheres within degrowth, it's become more popular. And even someone like Jason Hickel, who is the most popular figure right now, hasn't like embraced completely this discourse, but you can see that he has been going in these directions in the last years, because he talks a lot about taking over the state, about having a mass party, about the role of intellectuals, and like he talks about Cuba and China being a democracy. It's quite impressive to say that you might call China a democracy. So like you can see that it's going in this direction, and it's something that I personally do not endorse. As I said, like I want degrowth to be rooted in this idea of autonomy. And for me, as long as like I'm fond to this idea that when you use means of domination in order to change society, that might be the most effective to achieve change, but this is probably what will change in a way that will reproduce the means of domination in another way, instead of creating something that is emancipatory. So although I am not naive to the point that I will say that it's possible to just make everyone consent on everything, that would be obviously naive and would be against human nature in that case. But I want restrictions and coercion to be used in as little as possible, only to some extent, and in specific circumstances. And I want to focus on other things than that. And obviously that doesn't mean that it should not happen, but I think our impulse should not be on that.
Thank you. It's fascinating, especially what you said about limits and self-limitation. I think it's a very clever way of responding to the accusation of being authoritarian or authoritarianist. But I have a question about that, but I'll keep it for the Q&A bit because I'm aware of time. And so from authoritarianism, I will move to the opposite, to the opposite end of the conversation. So you once told me that degrowth used to be much more anarchist in the past, whereas now it's often accused of being too programmatic, for instance. So can you tell us something about that as well?
Yes. So I'm lucky enough to speak French. I was not there in the early 2000s, but I can read French, and and there are still some of the early French degrowthers who are still active right now in the French world, who are really emphasizing anti-authoritarianism a lot, and who criticize a lot the kind of directions in which the English-speaking degrowth is going to. And if you read the work of someone like Latouche, and it's a lot focused on anti-authoritarianism and even quite anarchist. I talked about Castoriadis. Castoriadis is considered one of the pioneers of degrowth. He was not. He died when he had died when it started formally, but he was not an anarchist, but was quite close to it. Other precursors who were either anarchist or very close to it are Jacques Ellul in France, who is a figure that is not very well known in the English-speaking world, but I think should be more known, and actually was in the 50s, 60s when he was at its peak. He was also quite important. For example, one of his main book propaganda was Aldous Huxley wanted it to be he really wanted it to be published into English, and he really pressed for it to be published as fast as possible. For him, it was a key book that influenced him. Ivan Illich is the same. He was very close to anarchism, and many others as well. So yeah, there was more of this, and in degrowth spheres right now, internally there are a lot of controversies and debates around this shift, and especially as Haeckel has made himself more clearly in orthodox Marxist directions. So there have been quite a lot of backlash against that, and there are a lot of debates right now on the degrowth websites about all that. But there is still an anarchist literature within degrowth. For example, in the degrowth journal in which I'm part, there was a special issue on anarchy and degrowth that was published last year. And I would say that there are two strands of anarchism within degrowth. One is more focused on eco-communities, permaculture farms, about community work that tries to reproduce the values that we would want in the world, create little islands like that can, because they are in contact with the rest of the world, show example to others of the directions that we would want to go, and like this would spread these values. This is the more prefigurative part of degrowth. And then you have the more activist, combative versions of it that are trying to sabotage the system in which we are, trying to fight against some of the big bad ones, and or for example, try to defend some lands, such as was the case in the ZAD movement in France a few years ago. In which they try to defend a forest, for example, against a mining company or something like that. So these are the two strands of anarchism within degrowth. And just to conclude on that, I think it's quite unfortunate that these strands are being marginalized, because, well, in obviously the mainstream media don't talk about that too much, because they often frame the way of seeing social change through policies. So obviously anarchists are not the ones that are doing that. So obviously if what you want is enforcement of law, then anarchists are not the ones that change the world. But if you also think that what changes the world is the awareness of people, is a cultural change, then anarchists are much better at something like this. And I would recommend people to go and see an essay called The Shock of Victory by David Graeber, who talks about the fact that the alter globalization movement, of which he was part and was quite anarchist, was able to really delegitimize the the Washington consensus, the neoliberal consensus around the IMF, around the World Bank, and so on. And we still feel this effect today. It's not to say that capitalism has fallen down or neoliberalism is done, but it has been able to achieve something like this. He also talks about the anti-nuclear movement of the 70s, in which they have been able to delegitimize a lot the use of this energy and the construction of new power plants, for example. And we could also cite the May 68 movement and the like 60s and 70s new left movements that were quite close to anarchism as well, that were able to achieve a change of mindset around questions of gender and white supremacy and so on. And I think we can say that there have been quite a lot of significant changes on these fronts as a result of these movements. So I think it's important to say that and to continue to have these trends within degrowth.
Thank you. And I see that there are some more ideas in the chat, but we'll get to that in a second, although I couldn't but have a peek. So in a way, yes, it goes back to that idea of degrowth. I don't know if we mentioned it now or maybe in the past, but degrowth being not just an economic program, but a sort of civilizational shift. And that leads me to my next two questions. Yes, I think actually Leila is adding something. I think I do have that copy on my desk right now. Sorry. But anyway, sorry. This leads to my next questions. I will ask them together. And the first is that more locally, you've been involved with Degrowth London. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about what you do and what the aims of this project are, and then more broadly, what aspects of contemporary cultural life, so not economic, but not in economic terms, but culturally, what do you think we need to rethink, or maybe not you, you or other theorists?
Sure. Thank you for asking about Degrowth London. So we started it in 2023 as a realization with some friends and other people in London that there was nothing about degrowth in such a big place as London. It was a bit unfortunate. We created it, well, both to create a space for us to just to discuss about that, but also to spread ideas and to engage with communities and to make it more known. And since then, we have been doing several things. We have been running a reading group every month, a screening sessions also from time to time. We organize socials, and then we give presentations, we give talks. Sometimes we have been in festivals, we have been in schools as well. So we've done quite a lot of like spreading ideas about degrowth. One of the cool things we've also done is that we have created a fresque of what we think degrowth, some kind of degrowth in London would look like. So if you go on our website, you can see what we've been working on. For example, also last year we organized a fundraiser for a trade union. So we do quite a lot of things, and just generally, if you are interested about degrowth, I think it's a nice place for you to get involved, because it's we are run also without too much hierarchy. So it means that if you come with a particular idea and you are interested in like one particular aspect of degrowth, you will find people who are interested as well, and you can work on that together, and that's nice. So if you're interested, you can go on our social media. We have I think the most active is the Instagram page, but also on our website. I think, for example, that in 2 months there will normally be a workshop or a series of workshops about the links between degrowth and Palestine resistance. So I think it's an interesting topic. So if you're interested, you can get in touch. And about the question about what we need to question in current societies. So yes, you're right that degrowth, even still now, is still not just an economics field. Latouche, for example, talks about the fact that for him the priority is to decolonize our imaginaries. So it gives you this idea that it's really about changing the culture. And I would say that there are two main things that are the most questioned. The first is that we need to question this idea that in our societies, we are reaching what we are looking for, that we are living good lives. First, I find it extremely astonishing to see how many people are not meeting their basic needs, even in a place like as affluent as London, in which you can see so many homeless people, so many people who are suffering whilst having all this wealth. I think it's astonishing. But then when you go even for people who are themselves satisfying their basic material needs, there are so many people who are there is a crisis of meaning in the world we live in, and there are so many people that take antidepressants who are not happy, who are tempted by suicide. So you can see that this world that we live in is not providing what we are looking for. And one of the things that I've been particularly interested in is the happiness studies and the happiness reports, in which you can see that when you go beyond the like country level reports, you can see that in some indigenous societies, for example, they reach level of happiness when they self-assess themselves. Some reach levels of happiness that are much higher than anything that we achieve in places like London. And myself, when I did research with the Maasai, I did this same kind of measurements, and they reached levels that were much higher than anything that you see in these surveys. So for me, it shows that that our societies and the directions that they are taking and the meaning that we give to the good life and how we strive for it is not the right one. And then the second one is, which is related, is questioning the space given to economistic values and practices. Economistic in the sense that these are values that relate to the economy, not just to capitalism, but just like values that are about working more, producing more, about striving for profit, striving for money, as if that this was not just like for individuals giving them what they want, but also it's having a lot of impact on the environment and socially. So it's some people talk about degrowth being about de-economization of society, or about putting the economy in its place. And by this, they mean that the economistic values and practices, we do not want them to be completely abolished, not necessarily, but we want them to be put in place in balance with other social and environmental values that also need to flourish. And if the economy is just taking so much space, then the rest is not able to flourish.
Thank you very much, Adrien. And I will move on. I have a comment, but I'll keep it for the Q&A because I need to share some slides now. So bear with me just a second. Can someone please confirm if you can see the slides?
I can.
Okay, thank you. So this is because so obviously this is all extremely interesting, and as I keep repeating this word, but it's very topical, I think, today to talk about degrowth. And all these books that we talked about, all these theories are from the last decades or so. But we do happen to have, as part of our collections here at Senate House Library, more items that resonate with these ideas. Obviously, this is not openly degrowth, not at all. But one of these items, which were very kindly suggested by one of our librarians, Hansi Barton, thank you very much, is this letter. The title is A Letter from a Gentleman in Town to His Friend in the Country, recommending the necessity of frugality, from 1750, which is very interesting because it's not, okay, that's not good. Okay, because on page 4 here, you read this idea of the virtue of honest frugality. So I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's 25 pages long, but on page 4, for instance, it says, to mention the various follies, vices, and corruptions peculiar to these times would exceed the length of a letter, and indeed they are become so notorious that there is little occasion to enumerate them, their unhappy effects being already but too sensibly felt and greatly lamented also by every good man. I shall therefore say little more of them, but on the contrary, confine the subject of this epistle chiefly to one virtue, which, if it were once become fashionable, could not fail of obtaining the most desirable effects, and would bid fair, sorry, and would bid fair to root out many of those painful weeds that infest this land. The virtue I mean is an honest frugality. Sorry, I am terrible at reading those S's. But Adrien, I was wondering if you wanted to comment on this idea of honest frugality. Obviously not, I don't think anyone in this virtual room has read this letter except for us. But it's very conservative in a lot of ways. It's from 1750. It's really about being frugal to give money to the military, the kings, but there is still something that we can say, something we can say about this letter being a sort of ante-litteram degrowth document. Would you say?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting in the sense, and I've seen already a comment that talks about the Protestant ethic. So I think the person is spot on that. But like on a superficial level, it relates to degrowth in the sense that it's a version of frugality that is about, especially at the individual level, reducing consumption and not spending money in order to gain in other ways. And so in that superficial sense, this is close to degrowth. And in the letter, the person also talks about the fact that the government should be responsible and should not spend their money in stupid ways and so on. So in that sense, I guess it can also relate. But beyond that, I think it's interesting in itself, this letter, to show that there are different discourses of frugality, and that there are some that are quite different from degrowth. And I would say that this one is quite different, as the person suggested. When I read it, it struck me that it was really the Protestant ethic. So in the sense that it's about well, the Protestant ethic just generally is about like restraint today and like being like close to the moral virtues of the Protestant or the Christianity, in order to be closer to God in afterlife, and in order to gain in other ways. But well, the criticism would come from the fact, I'm thinking about Max Weber and his famous classical work on that really connected the rise of Protestantism and the Protestant ethic with the rise of capitalism, in the sense that these ideas of Protestant ethic were easy to be shifted to the idea that by restraining yourself today, by not spending money, you are able to accumulate money for the future, and you just accumulate it more and more and more. I think a person mentioned that, so I think it's spot on. So in that sense, it's very different, because it's a version of frugality that is also it's worth saying that it's clearly a letter from an elite person to another elite person. We don't know the authors, I understand, but it's a version that also makes me think about the philosophies of frugality within antiquity, so in the Romans and Greeks, in which many of them, not all of them, but many of them were about showing that we, the elite, can restrain ourselves, are moderate people, so we are the ones that should be leading the society and are worth having our privileges. And the masses are always following their instincts and their pleasures, and they are drinking and they are partying and so on. And we are the ones that are the more rational ones, and we should be at the head of the society. So in that sense, again, like there is really the emancipatory and aspects of solidarity that is missing in this letter. So yeah, some things are related, but I think among there are many different like philosophies of frugality that exist, and this one is, as you said, much more conservative.
Thank you very much. And I forgot to say that this item is from the Goldsmiths collection. Sorry. I also forgot to say, sorry, this is all housekeeping, that Adrien has written a chapter, part of the Routledge Handbook of Degrowth, which is part of the borrowable display of books on degrowth that is currently on the 4th floor. Correct me if I'm wrong, Leila, of Senate House Library. I understand that it's very popular, so there's very few items left already. which is good. But this is ebook. But anyway, sorry. I think I'm gonna end the slideshow. Sorry. Ooh. Okay. Can you see me again? Okay, thank you. And I think again, because I'm aware of time, we might move to the Q&A bit. So Leila, can we maybe stop recording, please? I think it's probably better.